And thank all of you for coming out today. And I guess also thank God. I was thinking that all the way up here because what a glorious day it is today. It almost allowed me to forget the shadow that inevitably hangs over everything that we do now. And I think that I'm probably speaking for many, though I don't know, when I say that as I look at the present situation, and as an adult person, I probably have 5.5 decades or so of experience to compare it to. I don't believe this country has ever been this close to the brink of self-destruction. And I do believe that if we do not wake up now, it is quite likely that, as the old saying used to go, we'll wake up dead. And this country will be gone. And a lot of people in it won't even realize it until it's so late that all they can do is lament their loss. Part of that is because we've forgotten how unique is the opportunity that all of us have who participate in the sovereign body of the people of the United States. Now, words like that, the sovereign body of the people, would rarely have been put together in the history of mankind. I can think of one or two examples, but I want to be clear. None of the examples I can think of, stretching back to the early days of the Roman Republic, Athens, and places like this, none of them correspond to what has been built up in these United States. For this country, as it turned out, is unique in the history of humankind. And I've spent a long time doubting myself before I dared to start asserting this in my speeches, but now I do it without fear because there is no parallel. And even if you wanted to draw one with this or that or part of it, country, racial group, guess what? The respect that is shown for God's understanding of who we are supposed to be is exactly what makes this country absolutely unique. So that eventually, whatever may have been on the minds of people in the founding generation and the decades that followed, they were able, because of their reverence for God Almighty, to set forward a basis for this country that not only spoke to their grievances and their plight and their aspirations and their hopes, but to the aspirations and hopes of every human being on the face of the planet. We are not just a nation. We are a nation of all the nations. We have gathered in this place people who come from every race and color and creed and kind. It may have taken us 2.5 almost centuries before we got to this point, but now I dare to say it, and we all ought to be proud. The door that was opened by the Declaration of Independence has had every kind of person walk through it. And they have joined together in the endeavor which we have then answered time and time and time again to stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith God in Christ hath made us free. And we have extended that liberty beyond ourselves in order to risk life and treasure and our very existence for the sake of those who were being deprived of it in other parts of the world, or who, God forbid, had never enjoyed it in the first place. I think we are long past the time when we must stop listening to those who are, even as I speak, poisoning the minds of our oncoming generations. They are telling them that this country never stood for anything but evil. They are drilling it into them that we are all about slavery and all about oppression and all about greed and all about this and that has no standing in the moral life of mankind. But I say unequivocally, and I've spent a lot of time wrestling with it, not just studying it and reading about it. Because I started from a vantage point that would have made me pretty susceptible to all of that. Before I realized that the slavery I lamented for my ancestors in the United States is a kind of slavery that has been endured by all the people of the world at some time in the history of their background, their race, their people. It seems to be endemic to our humanity that when people get power, they must abuse it. As somebody once said to a friend of mine, they were at that time co-staffers on Capitol Hill, and they were arguing about something and going back and forth about something, and my friend looked at him and said, but that would be an abuse of power. And his fellow cohort up there said, what's the use of having power if you don't abuse it? Now, I won't tell you that this was a conversation between one side that was speaking from the Republican point of view and another side that was speaking from the Democrat point of view. I won't point that out. And I bet you can't guess which one lauded the abuse of power as if it were a necessary privilege. But it doesn't require, I think, any guessing. Right now, we're in the midst, and I think it's the first time in my life that I see an election cycle in which what has come front and center is the choice between the ideology promoted by Marx and Lenin and all of these people that we now know as communism, and the understanding of right and wrong and truth and God that is the foundation of the United States. And I always thought that they would have to camouflage themselves and once they got into power, simply abuse it. But they have decided now, I guess because of their long access to several generations of our offspring, that they can take the risk of acting as if there has been an attractive and successful example of the implementation of so-called communism anywhere in the world. But guess what? Unless you're in love with tyranny and mass murder, there has never been any such thing. It is the wonder of the United States. We didn't escape the grip of evil and the abuse of humankind. No, we didn't. But one thing we did escape is something that when they're trying to abuse the United States because slavery ever existed on our territory, first they act as if it didn't exist anywhere else in the world. So the United States of America was the only place where slavery ever took place, right? I beg to differ. Why do I beg to differ? I beg to differ because if slavery had not been practiced in the Mediterranean basin, if it had not been practiced not just by white folks, but by black people and almost black people and people stretching all the way into Asia and down into Africa and throughout the world, then there would have been no slavery in the United States because my ancestors wouldn't have been sold to the slave traders. And they were sold into slavery by people whose skin was several times blacker than mine, probably. Why are we forgetting this? Why are we letting them get away with lying about the difficulty of what the human race has achieved in this country? And not the elites. I beg to differ. See, I think one of the interesting things, first of all, you have to examine the founders, and I think you can scratch several of them, and what you find is ordinary folks who did pretty well in an environment that allowed for that to happen. They weren't, by background, the sort of snooty aristocrats come over to tell everybody else what to do. They were people who had become part of an endeavor where relying on yourself and God was the choice that you had to make. And when you made it well, you did well. And when you made it badly, you didn't. But they don't want us to hear this, do they? They don't want us to remember it because we are so close. Not just to proving that a government of, by, and for the people can work. That we have done time and time and time again since the beginning. In ways, by the way, that I think if you've ever looked at it closely, I don't think that even the most sanguine of our founders believed that it would last this long or do this well. Because what they were proposing is probably the most difficult thing for the human race to do. And that is to come into harmony with itself. And to do so in a way that then allows people to move forward so that what they have accomplished can become a benefit for everyone like themselves, not in skin color or even in background, but in the fact that we are all of us created by our God and endowed by that God with all that makes us worthy, with all that makes it possible for us to live free. I don't know why we're forgetting this. There were generations in which I don't think it was forgotten. And I am beholden to several of those generations in the middle part of the 19th century because they took on an issue that I think all the founders themselves knew was in direct contradiction with the premises laid out in the Declaration of Independence. Somebody once asked me why I'm always talking about the Declaration. And I think a lot of people must be awakening to why as they watch what is made of the discussion of our Constitution. Because the ground that folks fought on in the Revolution, I think the word, which is the laws of nature and of nature's God, you have noticed that that is almost forbidden now from our politicians. I could be wrong about this, but I don't believe that Barack Obama ever quoted that accurately. See, because if you quote it accurately, you have to mention God. And what is it that they are trying to do? What is it that they tried hardest to do in the middle of the 20th century after we had been doing so well? And a cardinal error was then pronounced by the Supreme Court of the United States when they said that it is possible for this nation to survive without reverence for God. That there must be a separation of church and state. Otherwise, people will be treated with injustice. I beg to differ. I think it's quite clear in the history of this country that the only reason justice prevailed is because there were people who believed in God with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength. They did not believe in money. They did not believe in power. They did not believe in the allure of hedonism and all the things that are now being preached to our children as if they were a better destiny for our humanity. Instead, they believed in the simple truth that God intended us to do right and to love justice and to walk humbly with our God and to walk that walk no matter what. And we have done it. We have done it more and more, first perhaps in our separate ways, and then more and more together. Until now, you can hardly remember a conflict in which our people have participated, in which the cemeteries do not have lying side by side people who used to be fighting, but instead were dying for the glory of God and justice for the whole of humanity. I will not forget their sacrifice. I will not act as if their sacrifice meant nothing for the course of justice in the world, but I will remember this, that they would not have had the courage they showed, but for their faith in Almighty God. These people can say what they will. This nation would have come to nothing on a secular basis without that sense of right according to God. There would have been few, if any, battles for right according to human hope. It would all have been destroyed by the release of powerful human ambitions. Now, I want you to step back for a minute and think about what's going on right now. Because I, frankly, think that, are we all asleep or something that we're allowing something to take place right before our eyes that I think is quite transparent? But that, for the moment, we seem to be pretty at ease about. Matter of fact, we even allowed them to talk us into believing that what is going on is somehow going on because they want to be against Donald Trump. Come on, y'all. Do you really buy into this lie? That this is all about one person? Now, it was a person who dared to take seriously what? The commitments that he made in certain areas to the American people, the concern he had as to what was happening with our people. Let's take immigration as an example. I don't think there are very many Americans who think that immigration is a terrible, bad thing and we should have no immigration. I hate to tell you this, but as far as I can tell, we would have very few people in this country if it hadn't been for immigration. Americans not only are not against immigration, they have practiced it again and again and again and again. Otherwise, we wouldn't have built up this nation of nations. We would not have people of every race and color and language and creed and kind within the precincts of the United States. So don't let them try to talk you into believing that we hate immigrants and we hate immigration. What we do understand now is that the United States makes an invitation to people from all over the world. Not to come and simply be what they want to be, but to join with us in building a nation in which every human being has a chance to be what God would have us be. Otherwise, where is the hope that we shall all live together in peace? Where is the likelihood that we shall risk our lives in order to preserve our decent liberty? And yet I think, because we stood on the solid ground of a beginning that revered the Almighty One, we have found that it wasn't so hard, not just to draw people here for the sake of lucre and what they thought they would make in their pocketbooks. I don't think most people did that, otherwise they were crazy. Don't you think it's a little bit insane to be living for the sake of money and advancement and then get into a creaky old wagon and go out into an unknown territory in order to achieve your dream? This doesn't seem quite natural. And it continued, by the way, throughout the time when you could have called this a pretty open continent. Why did people keep trying it? They must have known that a lot of people who went before them died on the way. They died of the heat, and they died of the hostile folks who were receiving them, not in a unique way, but in the way people in all parts of the world had received those who were impinging on the life that they knew. I love the way some of the people who want to denigrate what happened in America forget that it happened everywhere on earth. That there isn't a place in Europe or Asia in which over the course of reading their history you do not find that one people moving into this place disrupted life for another people who then tried to fight back. And thankfully in most cases things settled down, but usually into a long reign of tyranny for whichever side had the mightiest sword. Is that what happened in America? It happened for a time, yes it did. I'd be the last person to deny that. But even at the very beginning, the voices were raised, the hearts were raised, the prayers were raised against the injustice, until it finally culminated in a battle that most of the founders knew was inevitable. It's why Thomas Jefferson, looking into the broad future, said, "I tremble for my country when I think that God is just and his justice will not sleep forever." It was awakened, however, by people who were feeling the truth of that injustice, not because they themselves were enslaved, but precisely because they knew that it was by God's grace and goodwill that they remained free. And so, enjoying that providence of God, they grew more and more unwilling to deprive others of the same providence, which they knew was his goodwill. And in that, I think our diversity as a people played a role, so that it became quickly clear that if we were going to build a country on abusing people, there would be no end to our mutual self-abuse. But there was. And it didn't just happen once that people answered that call, because I think we got into the habit. It's a habit that exists unchanged to this day, though I think our political leaders no longer can articulate or understand its origin. I think Americans have responded to the call to do justice, even when it was hard, even when they knew that they were going to risk their money and livelihood and the things that they hoped, including their children's lives. Why did we do it? Why did we do it at first in the Revolution? Why did they do it at second in the Civil War? Why did they do it again and again and yet again in the 20th century? The only time that we have ever doubted our vocation in that regard is now. And why are we doubting it? We are doubting it because we have allowed them to talk us into the lie that you can separate the conscience and heart and goodwill of America from the worship of Almighty God, from the truths of God, articulated in the Bible, passed on from generation to generation to generation, not as applicable to whites, not as applicable to people who are yellow, not red, not blue, not green, not black, but applicable to all human beings. Because God created us all, instilled us all with his own love for what he intended us to be. And now we're going to sit back and allow them to talk us out of it? Well, I would have thought that it was impossible, but then I lived through this so-called pandemic. I like the folks who are trying to come up with a word that actually describes it: plandemic, scamdemic. I don't know which one should use. And that doesn't mean that I discount that there was danger. Oh, no. The danger was quite purposeful. And you should understand the real nature of that danger once you realize that though it was not commonplace, I can still remember being scoffed at in the early days of the whole business, when the reading that I did and the little research that I did led me to the conclusion that this was all something planned by the communist Chinese government, because they knew they couldn't take us on fair and square. They couldn't come to challenge our military power, to challenge our character, to challenge our courage. So they thought that they would sneak in the back door and introduce into our midst a way of killing us, for which we would have to hold what? A little virus and maybe ourselves to blame. And it worries me a little bit. I will say this advisedly, because I know it's not going to please everybody, but I worry a little bit. In the aftermath of this business we went through with COVID-19, we now have an administration ensconced in power that consists of several people. When you read their background, they have great admiration for what the Chinese communists have accomplished in their country. Is that just a coincidence? Or should we be worried? Should we be worried that, as I believe, we did not show enough concern over what happened to the election in 2020? Because an election that resulted in admitting to power a cohort of people that include more pro-Chinese Americans than they include people who are pro-America Americans. This worries me. And I think it ought to worry us all. It ought to worry, by the way, not because we're all concerned just about America. Because you do realize when you get concerned about America, you have to get used to being concerned about just about everybody in the world. I hope we don't do it imprudently. We were tempted, to go everywhere and do everything like, what was it? JFK made a big deal of it, the policeman of the world. No, that's a hard job. It's hard, as you know, to police the country even, the cities and the towns and the counties of this great land of ours, unless you're really careful about who you put in power. And I think we've gotten too lax and complacent, too easygoing and forgiving in our politics. We didn't let them get away with the separation of church and state, but we have allowed them to get away with separating this people and our conscience and our understanding from the profound truths articulated, not in the Constitution, but in the document that laid forth both the premises and the will that are supposed to inform the Constitution, and for the sake of which its many provisions that, by the way, are aimed at curtailing tyranny of all kinds. And they're in there because the Declaration understood that no matter who comes here, we want to make sure the promises of God are kept, but also that the loving will of God is respected. That's why I balk a little bit when people talk about this as if our great concern is freedom. I don't think it is, by the way. And I know sometimes I'm listening to people, and I'll forgive them for falling into the preoccupation with freedom because it's what we're used to hearing, and we just go along with it. I was guilty of this myself. But then you sit down with the Declaration, and you realize that though it does proclaim that the people of the colonies are and of right ought to be free, that means free from shackles and chains, unjust in the light of what? The laws of nature and of nature's God. And I invite everybody, go back and look at the Declaration. They say we have to observe the scrupulous separation of church and state. Well, that's all well and good. But I think that you might question it a little bit when you realize that the most famous words in the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And among these are life, liberty, not freedom, and the pursuit of happiness. Unalienable rights. I spent a good deal of time when I was younger trying to understand as best I could the meaning of that word unalienable. It has connotations I don't think many people think through. Unalienable means that you can't get out from under it. You can't let it go. You can't put it aside. You can't escape it. If I tell you obligation, that's an obligation you can't escape. Doesn't sound to me like freedom. Sounds to me like a true burden. Are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Right, the second one. Now you listen to them and they get away with trying to pretend that right and freedom are synonymous. But that's clearly not the case. Because an unalienable right does not leave you free to do what? To do wrong. See? They're unalienable rights, not unalienable wrongs. They're inescapable obligations to do right. But then you have to have a standard of right. And what is the standard of right? The standard of right is the will of Almighty God. The standard of right is the work of the Creator and the Word that was with God and was God, through whom all things were made, and the Word that then became flesh and dwelt amongst us in order to show us how you must bear the obligation to do right according to God, no matter what it costs. Do you really think that so many answered the call? And these weren't people who were raised like the Spartans with swords in their hands and murder in their hearts every day to harden themselves for war. When Americans went off to war, they were often coming out from behind the plow, from where they had cared in some sense or other for the weakest facets of nature. so that they could bring forth from that the source of life for many, including human beings. You know, I have always found it kind of intriguing that at the end of the day, people not preoccupied with violence and war made such good warriors. You ever wonder about that? How did people coming from behind the plow, from out of the stores, from out of the lawyers' offices, go on the battlefield and do as well as folks who had made war the whole study of their lives? Because I think we were dealing with people who had an advantage. I guess I learned this a little bit from my father, because he was a warrior, he was a soldier. And as I got older, I started asking him. He was reticent, I think, to talk a lot about it, partly because who would go out, unless they're mad, and boast about how good they were at killing? I think it's something that even when the cause is right, it tempts you to be ashamed. But in the end, what is the redeeming factor is that we realize that if the cause is just and necessary, you do not have to be ashamed of yourself, but you do have to be ashamed of our humanity. I think that's part of the reason why some of the folks that I disagree with profoundly, I will look at them go out and do their demonstrations and demand justice and equality for this one and that one and the other one, and I don't just say, well, you need to think that through a little better and dismiss them as if with hatred. No, I don't. Because I can't look on anybody who takes the burden of justice seriously. But I see the work of God's hand. What we should be doing is making sure that people filled with a heart for justice and a heart for righteousness know what is the true source of justice, the true cause of justice, the true standard of justice by which this nation lived, by which its evils died time and again. And those who died in fighting for those evils could lift up their heads with pride and face their God with hope, because they were standing for what is right according to his will. It appalls me that we're allowing these people to deprive us of this now, but it appalls me even more that we sit back and take it while they deprive our children of its benefits. I frankly can't understand a bit of critical race theory and all this garbage. If race is so critical, how come Democrats have lied to us, spending all their time trying to erase racial differences? It's not that critical if you can get rid of it. No, they don't want to consider the fact that maybe it was part of the critical work of God. People who can't overcome the temptation to believe that we are not all one when we stand before God as representatives of the human race will probably have a hard time dealing with all the emotional conflicts that arise in the course of human life, in which one aspect of our heart, our soul, our spirit, our desire, our greed, our lust, our passion is at war with some other. I think God made us different because we won't be able to deal with the wondrous variety of his universe if we don't know how to deal with the differences without forgetting the God who made us one. But when we do remember him, then I think we have an advantage, because we have rediscovered the true foundation that allows us to say with understanding, out of many, one, because the many is an expression of the love and the will, of the determination and intention of the one true God who made us all. I think this is our hope. I think it has been that kernel, that seed of truth that even when some folks in this nation were doing things that weren't exactly kosher, like slavery itself, others learned from the doing how to overcome the evil, found within themselves the courage to do it no matter what the dangers they had to brave in order to live according to the standard of the one who made us all. I think this is part of what we're trying to express when we talk about the greatness of our country. I was always a little uneasy with that focus on greatness, because I think there's something about it that's not quite true to the American reality. We didn't become a great country. Indeed, for a time there, the greatest on the face of the earth, because our people hungered for greatness. I think our people were more likely to hunger for children that they could raise up in the way that they should go. Hunger for the patience and the love that would allow them to do that raising. Hunger for the sense of respect for one another that makes justice an important demand and also an important hope. I think many of the things that we valued most weren't about being great. They were about being decent. They were about being loving. They were about extending hope in the face of despair. They were about treating others as we would want to be treated. They were about the standard of God exemplified in Christ, who was willing to die, not because they thought him great, but because they did not understand the source of true greatness. I think that's still in us. But here's the rub. I think it's in us. But the folks who are now sort of wandering about to present themselves as our leaders, I don't think they understand the humility of our greatness. I don't think they understand that many of us wake up every day still humble about what we have been, about what we can hope to be, and knowing that our pride is not in our achievements, but in the loving presence of God, upholding whatever we did manage to achieve. That combination of hope inspired by our humility before the fact and truth of our reliance upon the Creator is what was clearly articulated in the Declaration. Now, final point in this little excursion. Why do you think it is that so many folks wanted to come and still want to come to the United States? I think part of it could be just greed and lust for this and that and the other, but I don't think people have become that stupid. See? And I know for a fact from the time I spent doing things abroad, even living in India and working with people from different parts of the world, I remember hearing over and over again this one phrase in different forms. When I asked them, as they came through my office as assistant secretary, as I dealt with them elsewhere, what is it? What is it that surprised them most about people in the United States? And you know what was said time and again until it became kind of, to me, an education in the way we are perceived? Many said they just couldn't believe how hard Americans work. And these were from people who had just done a tour around the country, looking at our businesses, looking at what goes on in all our different shops and stores and everything else. And they just couldn't believe how hard Americans work. You think we're working that hard because we all think we're going to be rich as Donald Trump? I don't think so. I think that we work that hard because we all have respect for two important beings who have a role in our lives. We all respect our God, and when we come to understand the loving will that helped to inform our creation, we learn to love ourselves in the love of God. And putting all that together, we become a people who combine a great humility with a great sense of true achievement. For if at the end of the day, what we achieve brings a smile to the face of the Lord of all the universe, what better fate can we hope for than to live forever in the good heart and esteem of our Creator? I think that has been the end of many of the good and decent lives our people have led, and that they have closed their eyes with satisfaction for two reasons. Because they did all they could for the home that God gave them on this earth, the home of their family, of their community, of their state, of their nation, and eventually of the world. But that they know that because of that perseverance, if the time has come to end our brief sojourn in this life, we go home, not to a place we do not know, because we know it well, for we have worked with all that's in us. We have worked as hard as we knew how to live up to the hope that God represented, to pass that hope on in our instructions and our example to our children, and to join together in order to preserve that hope, not just for ourselves, but for all humanity. This is a greatness beyond our understanding that we will not fully know until we hear the words we long to hear. Well done, my good and faithful servants. Welcome to the kingdom of your God.